So welcome along to our webinar tonight. It's really good to have you along. We are the TGC in Australia, and we're putting on this webinar to help people across Australia think about evangelism as we transition, as the restrictions begin to lift, and as we head back into the situation in the post-pandemic, or the reconfiguration of our culture, and aware of the huge shake-up in the way we live and in our economy and the way we think about our friends and neighbours. And we wanted to take this moment to think about evangelism as the restrictions begin to lift. So we've got a great panel tonight. The way it's going to work is that for the first 45 minutes, we'll be talking to our panellists and gleaning from them some wisdom and some insights into the opportunities that we do have for evangelism as the restrictions lift. And then the second 45 minutes of our time together will be over to you to use the Q&A function here on Zoom to ask any questions you like of any of our panellists or of all of them as we collaborate together and think through the opportunity that this is for us as the restrictions lift. So that's what we're going to do. I might ask the Lord's blessing on this, and then I'll introduce you to our panellists. Father, we thank you for this opportunity. Thank you for the TGC, for the technology that makes this possible. And we pray, Lord, that good things would happen as your holy and life-giving word is held out to our culture at this moment and time. In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen.
Well, let me introduce you to our panelists. I'll introduce you to all of them, and I'll give them all the same question, which is what have they discovered personally? So I'm not talking to you as a leader or an evangelist, but just as a fellow citizen of God's kingdom and a fellow foot soldier. I wanted to ask you where you've noticed opportunities or challenges for evangelism in your own life. So we've got David here, who's at the CMS training hall in Melbourne. We've got Paul, who is the director of the network of churches at Holy Trinity in Adelaide. And then we've got Eryn-May, Ezzy, as I call her, to her friends, and you're all her friends, you will be by the end of tonight, who is here at St Matthew's in Perth, serving particularly the university student ministry. So I'll start with David. Let us know a little bit about yourself and your context and family, and what you've seen personally on the evangelism front.
Thanks. Yes, I'm David. I lead the training team for the Church Missionary Society at St Andrew's Hall in Melbourne. Prior to this, I served in Nairobi in Kenya, leading a college that was training people from across East Africa for mission and evangelism, with a particular interest in urban poverty ministry. I'm married to Rachel. I've got three adult sons who have grown up and left home, and Rachel and I moved house on March the 27th this year, which was pretty much as lockdown was happening. Our removalists kind of said, "Oh, you're very lucky. We might be, the very last house that we're delivering to before we're all sacked," was what they said. So we kind of moved into our new home and went round to try and greet our neighbours. And I think that experience, what we found pretty much with everyone we went and knocked on the door, was a lot of fear. Like, people were very anxious, very fearful. This is back in March. Very happy to say hello, but not wanting to prolong the conversation. I think that sense that people are living with a lot of anxiety and fear, and I'm not sure that has gone away yet, or it certainly hasn't in Melbourne, where things are still very live for us here. I think perhaps the other thing that's really struck me talking to people is this sense of shock that we're not in control of our world. And I guess for someone who's worked cross-culturally, many of my students in East Africa knew that they weren't in control of their lives, and they knew that they weren't in control of their world, and they regularly had the experience of being blindsided by life circumstances. And so that kind of sense of shock that life isn't working as I expect it to, I think has been really noticeable. And I think gives them opportunities to you know, ask questions about some of the assumptions that people are making. I think there's lots of opportunities at the moment for worldview questioning. The world isn't quite working as people expected it to. That's been going on.
Thanks, Dave. We'll come back to you on some of those worldview questions a little way through. Thanks for sharing. Paul, same questions for yourself?
Sure. So I'm a bit different to David in that he's the globe-trotting Christian worker. I've been here in Adelaide since 1987, working in the same church and living basically in the same street. So no moves for us. I'm married to Sue, who was tested for COVID 2 days ago, but came back all clear. She's got the flu, but not that flu. And we've got 3 kids, all adults. So 2 boys and a girl. They're all married. And we have 5 grandchildren and another one in about 6 weeks. So it's all very exciting for us. In terms of what's been going on for us in this street, so we've been here, as I've said, since 1993 in this street. And what's happened over that period is people have kept building bigger and bigger fences that have locks on them that stop you getting in. So that's been the pattern in our street, isolation. So we've been preparing for COVID in a sense through people's social patterns. Then what's happened with COVID is like everywhere else, there was the great uncertainties. I think in our setting, people just not knowing what was going to happen and fearing that some of the patterns that had occurred elsewhere in the world were going to roll in here, that we'd see massive infection rates, massive climbing death rates, that sort of thing. And some of the people in my street are retirees. So the people who live next door to us are over 70. And one of those has suffered with cancer in the past and therefore was feeling very vulnerable. And their children said, you must not leave your house. And they did all their shopping and supplied all their needs. And I think that was a pretty common pattern for lots of people, that fear uncertainty. And yet at the same time, a growth in warmth and wanting to be connected in a strange way. Fear and uncertainties, but a desire to say hello from a distance. And here in South Australia, we're at a very different place to Melbourne. The infection rates have gone way down. We've had, I think, 1 reported case in a month. And so quickly life is bouncing back, not completely, but there's a sense in which the traffic is now back on the road. People, it feels very normal in lots of ways as we're heading back. It's almost, people are still aware. We're still not allowed to have more than 2,000 people at the football, so it's really serious. But there is a different swing, in the air, mood in the air, I think, yeah.
Thanks, Paul. And Ezzy, tell us about yourself and your situation.
Well, I'm in Perth here, same as Rory, and I'm on the pastoral team at St. Matthew's. And so it's been an interesting experience being a part of a church going through this time. And I live not too far away from church, just by myself, and now a lot of houseplants. There was a reasonable amount of houseplants before COVID, but I've definitely become one of those COVID happy jungles, and it's fine. I'm actually quite content with it. It's definitely my COVID silver lining, and I'm going to keep this going. But it's interesting, just as Paul was mentioning about how he had neighbours that were ill or elderly, and their families were very worried about them and didn't want them leaving their home, and were kind of bringing them groceries and things. That was this exact same experience of my neighbour next door. She's in her 70s, lovely place. I've been blessed to live in the same place for about 4 years now. And so I know a few of my neighbours really well. And but she was she felt so protected and loved by her family, but she felt so lonely from her family that she actually, for the first time ever, as friendly as we were as neighbours, the first time ever, she kind of texted me and said, would you like to come over for a COVID safe cup of tea? You bring your cup of tea and you can sit at one end of my garden and I'll make my own tea and I'll sit at the other end of the garden. And that was really lovely. So we normally our chats revolve around kind of the chat at the mailbox or the bin, or, you know, talking about the trees or the weather. But we actually had a few kind of COVID cup of teas, we started calling them, because she said it's just not the same on the phone. And I think, as she identified, and as we all knew, relationships just aren't the same on the phone. So it was really nice actually to have this new opportunity to kind of go deeper and to chat with her about, you know, what life, because her life just got really empty really quick. And my life got quite empty, but went from being empty to being online. And so I got to chat with her about what church online was like, and gave her our web address in case she wanted to jump on. Don't know if she ever did, but yeah. So it's been an interesting experience, particularly watching the uni students go through it as well. Most people loved kind of online lectures. You didn't always have to go, and now suddenly uni turns into all online lectures, and suddenly you really want to go back to uni. All my uni students are telling me. So yeah, but there's been some interesting different things happening in Perth as we kind of come out the other side as well.
Can I ask you about that? I want to transition now into a few of the things we wanted to share. So you're the representative younger than the rest of us person.
This is good, because normally hanging out with uni students, I'm not called young. I'm definitely called the oldie. So I'll embrace this title. This is great.
Now, maybe from our ancient vantage point, we assume that it just must be a bonanza for students and student-age people in their 20s and so on, that they're digital natives and this is their world and so on. But what are your reflections on the experience of the average non-Christian that you guys are reaching, having contact with and so on, of being online? And has evangelism, what's been, as we come, out of that, what's been the online experience of evangelism? What are the things you guys want to retain, or things that you're quick, saying this isn't working, let's get back as soon as we can?
Yeah, there's a few things, because definitely it wasn't that online life was tricky to work out for the kind of Gen Zs, millennials. We understand computers, digital natives as they are called, but it was the online nature of relationships which was different. So online relationships, I think, are very passive. So, you post something, but there's no response, or the response are in a different format. You post a video, you might get comments back. It's not the same as a 3D conversation. And so I think that it wasn't that helping people to get online was the issue, but online takes away, particularly as kind of church became online and Bible studies become online, it takes away any anonymity that you can have, and kind of, you can't just be an observer on the outside. It feels like a big commitment to show up and put your face on a screen and to have people looking at you suddenly. And if someone asks you a question, in an online Bible study or something, suddenly, you feel the pressure that you have to answer it more. So it really changed the nature of Bible studies as well, I think. But I think that also it just became, for everyone, but particularly, the young generation, everyone wants to go back to 3D life, but it wasn't exciting or fancy or new. And so there wasn't a novelty factor that came along with it, which is a bit of a shame. But we did change what we were doing kind of at church to help people have that option where they could feel connected but not feel kind of exposed. So we started doing kind of a Zoom after church supper, kind of, live chats, but we just have 3 or 4 people already organised to have a conversation. And, people could put in their questions in chat, or mostly just their banter through the chat. So there was a vibe of we're all in this together, but people could kind of still be a bit more anonymous. So it was less pressured. And we had people kind of that had rocked up at church, friends of friends, or just visiting, kind of been to one church 3D, and then COVID happened. And some of them just completely went dark in the last 3 months. But some of them have stayed on the edges of the communication. And then last week was our first week where we were able to have about 45 people together in a room. And I got to meet 3 people that I had never met, that had seen me online for the last 3 months. And so they knew who I was, and they'd just kind of been lurking in the background of church for the last few months.
Paul, I want to ask you this question. Thanks, Ezzy. Paul, is the opposite true? So you've got these, I guess, the younger generation who they're used to being online, and maybe it's not the novelty. Do you see any opportunities in your network where other people have got used to being online? Is that something that you can see a way forward to retain for evangelistic purposes, or is everyone just wanting to get offline as soon as possible?
It's a funny mixture. Like, I was thinking about what Ez was saying, that I had a son who did law, and so he finished his law degree maybe seven or so years ago. I don't think he ever went to university, actually. He was always online. So I don't think much has changed for university students, actually. But so I'm part of 10 churches scattered around Adelaide, South Australia. They've all transitioned into an online world, and we've had the same experience, I think. So that those who are at the younger end, university end, they've struggled, I think, to engage in some ways with the online stuff. Some of our older people have also struggled for other reasons, coming to terms with the technology, or just being thrown by being caught in the camera lens and not wanting to do that. So they've been very thankful and appreciative of being able to observe, cautious about interacting, in that sort of way. So I think what's happened for us, though, and I think this has been replicated in lots of churches around the nation, we've seen, as soon as we went online, a stack of people joining us online, and we've screened our services at the same time as they would normally meet. So people haven't just tuned in whenever they felt like it. These have been people coming on at the service times, as if we were meeting. And we've had maybe 50 to, it's hard to measure how many because you measure devices, not people, but we've had maybe 50%, 75% more people connecting with us for those services. It's tapering a little bit as people get adjusted to it, but nonetheless, it's a huge number of people, and we've got no idea who they are. But anecdotally, we know there's a stack of people. It's like we've added these rows of seats at the back of our church, and they're being filled up by virtual newcomers, and they're sort of anonymous looking in. It's very safe in their lounge rooms. And I guess we're trying to think through, where do we go there? How do we take those people with us when we start to meet live again? And how do we connect with them? So we're trying to do that now, but just aware that we'll need to be patient as we do it and not bounce back too quickly. Because if we do, I suspect we'll leave all those people who are just putting their toe in the water. They'll just get left behind, I think. And it's been interesting that lots of our regulars have found it incredibly easy to invite their neighbours and friends when it's online. It's funny, really. It seems like a low relational risk thing to do, and yet it's a rich gospel content way of getting people connected. It's strange. It's sort of at both ends in that way. And so I know sorry, mate.
I was just going to, have you guys tried any of the, I heard Nikki Gumbel talking the other day about them doing Alpha Online, that being quite successful. I don't know, you or maybe other people, has anyone tried any online, the kind of course that you would do around a meal or in a home? Has anyone tried that online? Has it worked?
We've been doing it in a few of our churches, running different courses, trying to connect people in to Zoom. Often it's in some cases, they're people we were starting to connect with. So in one of our churches, they'd started an evangelistic course that went over 4 or 5 weeks, met for 1 week, and then COVID hit. And so they pushed it online, and they've had good retention with people doing it. And now we're thinking through, well, how do we keep rolling that on? So we had a few of those courses and people connecting in. my wife Sue has been meeting with someone online doing the word one-to-one, just, one-to-one Bible study. And she said in an interesting way, doing it online is easier than meeting live. That is, it's a very equalizing thing to do. On the screen, no one has sort of an upper hand. And she said it's been a very comfortable space to ask questions because I suspect there's less relationally at stake doing it. So so it's been an interesting experience for us. I think a really good one in terms of connecting with people.
David, I wanted to transition a bit into your. You think a lot about culture shock and reverse culture shock and re-entry and so on for missionaries. We've talked before. I don't know if you wrote an article or something online, but I feel like I've heard you in other contexts help us to reflect on this. So give us a sense of, with missionaries, what it's like for the re-entry thing. And then maybe if that is a fair analogy with what we're going through collectively, whether there's an evangelistic edge to that.
Yeah, so culture shock is the experience of going to another culture and you leave your home culture, your passport country, where you know how to operate, you know how to go into a shop and order a coffee and all this stuff, you know how to do your grocery shopping, and you go to a new culture and the rules have changed and you don't really know how to operate. You feel like you're making blunders all the time, and that causes stress. So you're just in culture shock, you're in stress from cultural transition. And I think we experienced culture shock in Australia when we went into coronavirus, because all the things that were normal for us, suddenly we had to do differently and we didn't know the rules. Like we used to just walk into a supermarket and stand in a queue and buy our groceries, but now we've got to stand on a green cross and everyone's squirting hand sanitizer all over the place. And I'm not sure if I can pick up the basket, or I might die if I handle the basket of the, in the supermarket. So that's the sort of going into it. That's the culture shock. What the gospel worker then finds when they leave after however long and come home, whatever home means, is that they've changed. So their own values and their own sense of what's important will have changed. But the country that they're returning to will also have changed and moved on in their absence. They'll have had little glimpses of that on home assignment every 3 years. But I think that's, as we come out of lockdown, and different states are obviously in different places on this, we're not just going straight back into the situation we were in back in January. We're re-entering something that is different, and we're not quite sure again what that is. And the process of all of this has changed us as individuals. Different people have experienced coronavirus very differently. For some, it's been just terrible. They've absolutely hated it. It's been immensely stressful. Other people, like, it's been all right. It hasn't, introverts, perhaps their work life hasn't been that disrupted. Not trying to homeschool children or whatever, and it hasn't been that bad. They're wondering what all the fuss is about. And so that the re-entry is that sense of coming back into something and the rules have changed, but you can't quite work out how.
And David, can I ask, and other people might want to chime in, but if you could start us off, what are the kind of resources within the gospel that you think most address that? Like, what are the, I have read you thinking about fear-based, shame-based cultures and the way a culture reconfigures the parts of the gospel that we want to that connect most profoundly. Is there a guide to the aspects of what we have in Jesus that most powerfully speak to someone in that situation? What are we going through, and what does the gospel say to us in that situation?
Yeah. I mean, I think at a very big picture level, the Christian faith is a translatable faith. So we believe that we can translate God's word into another language and it retains its power as God's word, and that I can follow the Lord Jesus and be his disciple from within Australian culture, or from within British culture, or from within Kenyan culture. And that can be a meaningful thing as I obey God's word and live a cross-shaped life, but from within my own culture. Whereas most other world religions impose a culture on you. You have to become part of a much more static cultural form. So of all the, if you're thinking about this as a world religion, Christian faith ought to be able to take this in its stride, because we believe in the translatability of the gospel at a big picture level. Perhaps at a more specific level, I think thinking about how we speak the gospel into people's lives from their starting points and from the emotional experiences that they've been dealing with. You know, for those of us who've been in pastoral ministry, perhaps we're used to dealing with people who are frightened, who are facing maybe a cancer diagnosis or a horrible bereavement or something. But now most of the people that we might be chatting to have been through a recent experience of significant fear and anxiety, and a sense of loss of control, and I think are struggling to find meaning. And so working out for each of those people, you know, how do we speak the meaningfulness of following Jesus into that uncertainty? I think we do have a great opportunity at the moment, but we shouldn't kid ourselves that that'll last too long. As we come out of lockdown, people will harden their hearts if the Bible's to be believed. So
it is it's been striking that I've noticed you've used that language a couple of times, and I've noticed it come up that words around fear and anxiety and loss of control, more than, I think if Australia had an experience where there were hundreds of thousands of deaths, we might be in a kind of theodicy type moment where people are saying, if there's a good God, how could he allow this? And I think I keep hearing, and maybe this is confirming it tonight, that the set of questions are more, almost more wistful than that. I had one of our guys, one of our ministers here, Paul Young, who heads up our evangelism, had one of his friends, he's a very keen personal evangelist, one of his friends, a secular guy, said to him, "Oh, don't you guys have a verse about be still and know that I am God," or something like that? Tell me about that. And he wanted to know almost practically, how do religious people, as he thinks of us, I know you guys have some resources when things are out of control, and I'd be interested to know what they are. But maybe if other people had, what do you think of the big, the apologetic, the questions that people are asking that maybe are these opportunities?
I think what David was picking up on in terms of that loss of control. So there's that, here in Australia, we have that veneer of everything is predictable and controllable and settled, and, you know, that confidence to wake up and every day pretty well will go the way we've planned it to go. I mean, we know that's not completely true, but it's more predictable. And I think this is like a brick that came in on our glass houses. You know, it sort of shattered that understanding. And there was, for many people, I think, that sense of being very unsettled. I remember talking to one guy who was early 70s, and he said, "It's just hit me that I'm in the vulnerable category, and that, you know, if I get COVID, there's a, you know, whatever it was, a 1 in, 8 chance I'll die." And, you know, it was a very sobering sort of moment for him. And I think for us as Christians, the fact that we have a secure anchor in terms of relationship with God through Jesus, it's very firm. I think it's got to be worked out, but it's very firm. I've been reflecting on Philippians and Paul being in a Roman prison, and about the way in which he's so settled there. And I think personally, it can't have been what he was planning to do with the rest of his life, you know, like being in prison, potentially facing death. He was a church planter, traveling evangelist, you know, so it must have been very frustrating at one level. And yet you read the chapter and you think, oh, Philippians 1, he is just so settled and secure in Christ and purposeful in that context. And I think we're in that space as Christians where we're able to be settled, purposeful, confident, even when we don't control the environment around us, because we have someone who does, you know. we trust in. You know, I think it's quite profound, I think.
As what do you sense with a younger generation? Are they similar things that are you hearing about anxiety? Are there things that you like? Paul talking about Philippians. Are there particular passages that come to mind, or angles in for the gospel, or apologetic questions that younger people are raising?
Yeah, I think that it's so interesting, isn't it? Because in one way, like COVID has been actually quite a uniting time. Like actually COVID is a great equalizer. And so it doesn't matter like your age, your stage of life. Actually, it's caused us all to ask questions in different ways. But I think there's something in that kind of goes, wow, okay, so right now I'm united with actually everyone in the world. We're all asking the same questions. And then I think that's that kind of, you know, you can really resonate with people on a deeper level. I think normally in our society, we kind of walk past people and you say kind of, hi, how you going? And the kind of quick intended response is, you know, oh, good, yep, fine, thanks, good. But in this time, I think people actually are really caring what the answer is a bit more. And so the hi, how you going, it's turning into a bit more of the expected answer is a bit more that there's going to be kind of some struggles, maybe some suffering, maybe some, you know, actually I'm not going that great. Yeah, me neither. There's a uniting and actually we're all kind of going through this thing together. And so I feel like that gives us that opportunity to ask those deeper questions. And for most of the younger crew that I talk to, it's not the same fear like Paul was sharing of his friends realizing I'm in a really vulnerable category here, like I'm in a larger percent. They know that they're in the minority, like they're in the very small percent, you know, they're the strongest, healthiest bodies that should be able to cope with this virus. But it's more of that realizing that I even if I didn't have lockdown plans, I had plans for the future. And now I don't know what they're going to look like. You know, like I had plans to graduate next year and get this grad position. And that was going to kind of be the first step of this rolling out kind of 5-10 year trajectory. But now suddenly that whole idea of kind of getting that secure position isn't there anymore. That the whole house dream is even further down the track. And even though no one talks about buying a house incredibly, like it's a real possibility, pretty much anyone anymore, but it is that kind of far off dream of that's what I'll do when I grow up, when I get bigger. And now it's kind of like a fear of the future as opposed to a fear of the immediate. You know, your mortgage is not in question right now, but that kind of fear of I kind of had some vague plans and I don't know how to deal with not being able to have plans now.
Thanks, Ezzy. David, can I ask you, you mentioned before that in Nairobi and in the majority world, your plans not working out as intended is a fairly normal part of life. The bus doesn't show up, the funds don't come through, the funeral goes for 5 days and you can't do the exam and so on. The other thing I'm interested in is, as I understand it, death is a taboo in our culture in a way that is perhaps not as much of a taboo in other cultures. You might tell me that that's not true, but if that is true, do you think there is a moment here? Have we got a small window where death is an acceptable topic?
Well, I mean, it's certainly easier to raise the subject and talk about it. We've only had 102 deaths in Australia, but you know, many Australians, probably the majority of Australian people are connected global citizens, and I'm sure many of you would be like me with family in the UK who, you know, they're still getting 300 deaths a day in England at the moment, and you know, so the mortality rate around the world isn't a hypothetical thing for many Australian people, and so they are confronted by real fearfulness for extended family and friends, perhaps in the States or in the UK or wherever, and good reason to be frightened in that sense. But I think the worldview thing is very significant. So I think for my Kenyan students, they knew that they weren't in control of the world, and their worldview was Christian, but with what sat behind that often was African traditional worldview, which would assume that everything that happens in our day-to-day lives has spiritual cause and effect. And so that the world that you inhabit as an evangelical African Christian is an intensely God-occupied space, if I can put it like that. God is very present, and you get a flat tire and disrupts your journey to church, and you go, oh, you know, Satan tripped me up. And that's just naturally where people go in their minds and their thinking. Whereas I think for us, we live at the other end of the pendulum swing from that worldview, with Charles Taylor paints the image of us living kind of under a glass dome, and we've kind of put a glass dome over our Australian culture, and God is on the outside, and is distant and unknown and unknowable, but also irrelevant. But that irrelevancy, I think at the moment, you know, your story of someone asking, where's that verse where it says, be still and know that I'm God? That's showing that the glass of the dome is cracking, and that people are seeing inconsistencies and incoherences in their worldview that I think is a great gospel opportunity.
Hey, thank you, David. We're going to open up for questions in just a few minutes. So I think you can see the question function and go for it from there. There's ways of voting them up and down, and we'll have the next part of the session till just before the hour to ask any questions you like of any of the panelists, and to throw in suggestions and shoot through together. But what I might do is go around and ask a previously unplanned question of each of our panelists, which is, given that's beautiful image from Charles Taylor, of the powerful image of the dome cracking, that there's a way of the transcendent realities of God and death, and where the gospel has a chance, and maybe it's a small chance, maybe the more we resume normal play, the more distant this moment will come. So I want to ask each panelist, what is one practical thing you think we could do over the next few weeks or months that you just think, as personal evangelists or in leadership in churches and so on, one moment that you think, let's give this a crack, let's do this for Jesus. So I'll start, because I didn't warn you about this, so I'll give you a chance to think of yours. I noticed on our street, for about 5 weeks, we were having drinks on Friday afternoon at 5 o'clock. We were sitting miles apart from each other, and then got closer and closer. And we now know everyone's name on the street. And it was really beautiful. I think it's unsustainable. Like, I don't think it's a colossal tragedy that we're not doing that as we go back. But I think I want to go back to a peacetime model of maybe once a month reinitiating that and having a reunion, and using the Sam Chan thing, which I think Ezzy talked about when we were planning this. Sam talks about coffee, dinner, gospel, that for whatever reason, our culture, it's hard to talk about God at work for the kind of Charles Taylor type reasons, but we've had this point where we've got to the coffee conversation, maybe even the dinner conversation, and I want to seize that moment, at least on our street, before that window goes. But I might send it to David, Paul, and then Ezzy. Any final practical things before we open up for questions?
Yeah, I mean, I think just following up that idea of the worldview cracking, just to ask people, how has this been? How has the coronavirus thing been for you? How have you experienced it? And I think most people have found it pretty stressful and difficult in some way or another. I'd be surprised, the majority of people are going to say something about it being hard, and then just to push into that, what's been hard about it? Why, what have you been struggling with? To try and unpack that a little bit. And then, if there's an opportunity within that kind of conversation, just to share a Bible story, to have a Bible story at your fingertip and go, a story that's been encouraging me is, just pick a Bible story, a parable or something like that, and just like, do you mind if I just share a story that's been an encouragement to me as I've been, struggling with the same things that you've been journeying with, and then see where God takes those kinds of conversations.
Beautiful. Thanks, David. Paul?
It's been interesting in our street that I think we've had more conversations with people over this time than we ever have before. So we don't have a gated big fence at the front of our house, and Sue, my wife, has actually put out these laminated pictures our grandchildren have done and just put them on the front of the fence. Did some leading into Easter, you know, different ones, just replaced them. So we've got people going past who are just stopping and looking at those. And what we tried to do at the end of each day, you know, around 5, is sit in the front veranda and have a cool drink. Normally people would go past, and if they saw us there, they'd turn their eyes away. I think they felt like they'd be intruding to look into our yard and look at us. And now they'll stop and they'll have conversations, even people we don't know. And it feels to me like that. I don't think this will last necessarily, but it seems to me that we have these connected opportunities. You know, one of our neighbours yesterday, day before yesterday, I was just going past their driveway, got in a conversation. Their sister had died, and not from COVID. In fact, we've had more people die in our church from other reasons than all of South Australia have died from COVID right now. You know, but do you know what I mean? Like those conversations I don't normally have with people, but there's an openness. So I think what you were saying before is, how do we, you know, well, David, yeah, how do you collect that up as you move forward, rather than it be a moment when we talked, you know, we're all in this together, and then we weren't, you know. So we're thinking, you know, can we get people together for a catch-up barbecue? We invited everyone onto a WhatsApp group so we could look out for each other in the street, and we're hoping that WhatsApp group will meet together, you know, when we're coming through this, when it's appropriate and people feel confident to. Yeah, how do we keep those relationships rolling? And we've got those relationships now, and I'm hearing lots of people in the same sort of space, you know, wanting that. So how do we go? Like I was talking with I'm in a Bible study group with a group of guys who are more than 10 years older than me. So they're all in their 70s, right? So they're the vulnerable group.
Mind-boggling, Paul.
Yes.
He's older than you.
Right. And they're all really keen to get back together again face to face because of where they're up to. But one of those guys lives in a street where they had your equivalent. They have Thirsty Thursdays, where they did this pre-COVID. They just started inviting the whole street to someone's house, and they'd all take it in turns, and people would turn up on Thursdays at 6 for an hour and bring everything on. So I think it's achievable outside COVID as well. But I reckon our street is full of workers, professionals, business owners who just haven't got time to scratch themselves. Mm-hmm. And they've asked the question of, I'm working really hard for what reason? You know, and I think longing for something with a bit more depth to it. So trying to capture that and go next steps with it, I think, is what we're trying to work out.
That's great. And we just had to open up for the question time, but Ezzy, can you give us your answer?
Yep. The speedy answer is obviously I think we've all talked about the different opportunities that are there, but I think as we also get thrown back into the world, I think we need to be conscious for praying for God to give us eyes to see them, because we might be like, oh, I don't really have any extra opportunities. But just even through talking with you all and thinking of that, you know, Sam Tan coffee dinner gospel, I'm like, with my neighbor next door, I'm like, okay, we've definitely, you know, I've had 4 years of kind of chit chat, kind of coffee. Now we've had real live coffee. I need to figure out, I've got a small window. I think I need to move that to the dinner kind of conversation. So, and there's lots of those little kind of relationships that have just moved one step a little bit deeper. And so I think all of us to pray for that God would give us eyes to think, what is the next step in all of these relationships that I can move this to a deeper conversation, and so I can move towards sharing the gospel. And I think like we talked before about code being that uniting factor, and I think potentially, if we do really get on the other side of it, that will start to fade as we get back to the busyness of our own lives. And so I do think we want to seize that uniting while we have it. and show that actually we do have an anchor in Jesus beyond that. So work out how we can say, yeah, I'm with you. I understand the kind of the fear, and, I can understand the pressure and the loneliness or the kind of overwhelmedness. But then kind of go, it's been really good for me actually to, the Bible teaches me as a Christian that we're not in control, but God is. And so this has been a great time for me to be actually trusting what I know to be true. Because even as a Christian, I can be forgetful. And so this has been a great time for me to trust the truth that I know about God, that he's in control. And just, I think, sharing little bits like that of personal testimony about how God's been working in us, I think will open up as the relationships get deeper, open up more conversations.
It's great. We've got fantastic questions here. This is going to be a rich feast. I'm going to send the first one to Paul. There's a few I think I can batch together here. Someone said our evangelistic efforts in churches can be a bit hit and miss. What are some common mistakes you see for the ways churches do their evangelism? What would be a way to fix it? And I might batch that with someone's asked, what are things that we used to do that you won't restart? There's been a helpful question going around. I've noticed it on the internet in various places about what have you stopped that you shouldn't restart again? There's that kind of Mary Kondo cleaning out the clutter and not necessarily getting busy again too easy. So Paul, I might ask, have you or the pastors in your network, the evangelists and so on, thought about that? Are there things that you think, actually, that wasn't very effective, let's stop, are things that you think this maybe is an opportunity to do a bit of a reset at a strategy level evangelistically?
Yeah, I think perhaps hitting it from a different angle, I think one of the things that I've been really aware of through this time is the way in which, and I think as he was talking about it, the way in which COVID has sort of put everyone at the same level. And what it's been good for professionals like me to be reminded of, I think, across the board, is that we have churches full of people with relationships, and the big task we have is to enable them to connect well with the people they're connected to, rather than to think that that at an organisational level centrally, that's where the action is. So it's the distribution of energy to support and encourage people who are on the front lines with their neighbours, with their friends, with their family, people at work, all those sort of connections. And what I've seen is the way in which so many people that I know have come alive with the opportunities they've had to be talking to others and to invite them online, and the way in which that's crossed boundaries too. We've got friends interstate who've been joining us online every Sunday morning, and now the goal will be to connect them locally, but it's created quite extraordinary opportunities. So I think that's been a real reminder that the temptation, I reckon, for people who are church workers is to think the things that we organise at a church central level are really going to be where the action is, but they're only ever supporting what happens at the front line, if I can put it that way. So
yeah,
that really is the most helpful thing. What are we going to leave behind? I think we're still wrestling with that question. One of the challenges, again, for this is really a pastor thing right now, but I've noticed that when COVID hit, everything got very centralised. The professionals were the ones who were running and putting together everything because we weren't allowed to meet with anyone else. And that sort of centralised the priesthood of just a few, rather than all believers. So there were just a few running everything, which is very dangerous. And one of the challenges coming back is to make sure that we don't stay there. Actually very quickly move to a space where we capitalise on all that's been going on at the grassroots level, rather than what we've been broadcasting on a Sunday. And with the team guys, the staff I'm working with, part of our challenge has been to say we're putting all this time into these public activities, but we want to move into much more of that connecting and training and enabling people to make the most of their opportunities, and how can we support that happening. That's one of the things that we're trying to focus on quite a bit right now. Yeah.
Yes, that's huge, and that's certainly we in our context have thought that we just want to, every time it's like we've moved everything out of the house, and you want to do that kind of Mary Kondo thing and think, do I want to bring this back in? Because our churches are full of people who have fantastic contact with the wider secular Australia. That's really, really helpful, Paul. Thank you. I'm going to ask this one. What are some, maybe this, David, you might help us with this. What are some ideas for conversation starters for people who don't bring up the faith and worldview and so on? Is there a way to break that kind of glass dome? Do you see any, especially obviously in our Western culture or maybe in our multicultural culture, are there conversation starters that can open that up from the side and start to bring that worldview question to the fore?
Yeah, I mean, I think certainly at this stage where the fear and anxiety in some states continues and is a fresh memory in other states, just asking people what that was like and what were they frightened of, what were they anxious about. Now for us to drill into that, we've got to be disciples of Jesus who aren't frightened about dying, which is a very big challenge, I think, for us. I kind of put the spotlight of that onto my own heart, and I'm not frightened of being dead. I'm not too excited about the process of getting there. But, to be not frightened of dying and death in the current climate is a massive thing. And, I think there's a confidence and a joy that comes from that. That's a real witness. So, just saying to people, what were you frightened about? What were you anxious about? And then if they start, saying, well, I never really thought about death and dying before. I wouldn't want to say it quite like this, but you go, well, really? Have you never thought that you might die one day? Actually, most people have never particularly had that thought in a secular Western culture, unless they've had some kind of significant health scare or bereavement. But I think we do live in denial about sickness and death and suffering, and that structure of denial isn't working at the moment. So trying to find ways to unpack that with people and have those kinds of conversations, and to do it out of a place where we can genuinely in our own lives demonstrate that we're not frightened, I think is very powerful.
Yes, and an unusual experience for us, I think, to see a worldview on the back foot, because secularism, when everyone's prosperous and denying realities, is pretty powerful account of the world and pretty happy place to live in. But we're in this unusual moment where it's comes up short when you're facing death and suffering and anxiety, and so which maybe Ezzy, I might throw this your way, but other people might chime in. There's a couple of questions here. So Rob has asked about, hi Rob, about mental health being a growing concern. I think it almost feels like, doesn't it? Phase 1 was the physical coronavirus. Phase 2 is the mental health crisis, and then maybe there's an economic crisis a few months down the road. So any tips for gospeling into mental health situations? And then someone else has asked for, where are we? Grace has asked about Bible verses, Bible references that speak to those who suffer COVID anxiety. So I might start that with you, Ez, but other people might want to chime in, especially on the Bible verses.
Yes. It's wonderful that people are willing to open and to trust you to talk about these things. And because I think it is particularly something you want to tread carefully with. I don't think we can just kind of throw out platitudes or kind of pull out Bible verses that, and we don't want to misapply them. We don't want half-truths becoming untruths from the Bible. So I think we need to be careful here and hear what people are saying. When we always talk about when people ask a question, there's usually a question behind that question. So I think the first one is just treading sensitively and prayerfully. But I do think that Well, look, it's all right to know the context, but I think usually because I deal with a lot of people with anxiety and depression, Christians and people who aren't Christians, and trying to figure that out. But I do think we need to think of it like a chair. Like a chair can kind of usually stand on 3, but even more securely 4 legs. So if someone is struggling with mental health, we need different legs to this chair. And if you try to be everything to someone, then it's just going to topple over. So the way I try to talk about it with people is, we need a doctor. We might need a psychologist or a psychiatrist to help us out here. So they're one leg of the chair. And then we need some family, some friends that are going to give us some social support. And then, if you're a Christian, then you also need someone to help you with some spiritual support. So you need a pastor as well. So I feel like the leg of the chair is helpful for both people in the conversation to work out, well, which leg can I be to help you in this, so that we don't end up trying to be a one-legged chair and it all falling apart. So I think once that's kind of established, really kind of working out and sharing, understanding people's anxieties. And I think kind of heading to, I think it was Grace's question that you mentioned as well. The place that I kind of usually first start with is that if you feel like this is broken and you feel like you're broken, or you feel like you're suffering with the brokenness, then that's what God felt too. Actually, this is why Jesus came, because this world is broken, and we don't have to pretend like it's not broken. And sometimes we do. Sometimes we live in a life where we kind of paint it to kind of feel like it isn't so broken. But feeling the brokenness is not a bad thing. Because that's why Jesus came. He came to fix the brokenness between us and God, but also between us and each other. And the Bible verse that I kind of, once we've acknowledged the brokenness, I just kind of drive straight to Revelation 21 of thinking, actually, when Jesus returns, he will fix it all and it will all be complete. And there will be no crying or mourning or sickness or pain, because actually we'll be with God. The old order will be passed away, and the new order will come, and that won't be broken. So if you're feeling the pain, then you don't have to be scared, and we have to run away from that. But remember that Jesus came for the brokenness.
Beautiful. David, can I send this one your way, which is a little bit off centre, but I think it might be helpful to have it. So Kamal has asked about the race, the protests in the United States over the George Floyd's killing and so on. Obviously, we're not here to address the complexities of that issue, but just in terms of a worldview thing, do you think there's anything going on there in terms of it's now added a justice issue to what was an anxiety and a medical and an economic issue? I wonder if you could help us to think about whether that is helping us to understand a worldview and the tensions or the opportunities in for the gospel in whatever it is that means.
Yeah, I mean, I pray God that this situation will be a decisive turning point in racism and race relations. But I think it's too soon to know that. We can look back and know that the Rosa Parks incident was a turning point in racial equality in the States and around the world, but you probably didn't know that at the time until sometime later. But certainly we should be praying fervently that this is a decisive turning point. Is it because it's happened in the context of COVID and coronavirus? I mean, there may be some overlapping things going on here. Just picking up from what we were just talking about, definitely there is huge levels of anxiety and stress and mental health issues in our community. But in Australia, I mean, I personally don't know anyone in Australia who's had coronavirus. I know heaps of people who've had it in England, and I know people who've died in England. I don't personally know anyone in Melbourne who's had coronavirus. So where is that anxiety coming from? Of course, it was here and present in our society before coronavirus. We live in an anxious age, and the reason we live in an anxious age is because the project of secularism is to pursue my own flourishing and my own authenticity. And, you know, I'm under this immense pressure from a secular culture to be, you know, uniquely me and to pursue my own project and to flourish as I express myself in completely individual ways. And that project is always a lie, but coronavirus really exposes it as a lie. Like, the idea that the last few months have felt like flourishing hasn't been true for most people, I don't think. And so, you know, we're facing in Australia a mental health crisis and anxiety because of domestic violence, because of family broken relationships, but also I think because the flourishing project is being exposed as not working. So I wonder if that is resonating with the Black Lives Matter kind of protest, as saying, you know, there are bigger things going on here. Like, actually, I need to care about other people's flourishing, not just my own. And, you know, the secular project of self-love is being shown as a lie. And it would be great if what the Black Lives Matter protest was truly about was demonstrating genuine other person-centered love. I mean, I pray God that it is that, but I think time will tell. We're too close to it to be able to have an answer to that.
Thank you. Paul, I'm going to send this your way. So Mark Grimbridge has asked a specific question: what prompted people to your church online? And do you know how they got there, how they found their way there? And I might back that up with, there's a few questions, great questions from Paul and from David, talking about, no, I was thinking about David's question, from Jess's question. So you got people saying they've enjoyed the slower pace of life, spending more time with family. Maybe there's a thing there where people won't want to step back into frenetic activity-based church, and they might not want to they might feel that there's not that time and energy to spend with non-Christian friends. And other people have asked, Paul, about the new normal. So let me package that together as related but not exactly the same. Number one, how do people find their way to your church online? And then 2 and 3, is there a reluctance to go back to being as busy as we were? Is that going to impact evangelism? And is there a new normal that's different from what we went in with?
Okay. How did people get online? I mean, partially I can't completely answer it. So you can't tell from just measuring devices on Sunday how people got there, obviously. So I'm basing that on the chat feed that we've received back on Sunday, people connecting in as newcomers, telling us how they got there, and some anecdotal stuff around it. So anecdotally, there are a couple I was talking to last week who were saying that their parents-in-law had tuned in to church and been regularly tuning into church since COVID hit. And they said they have never attended church ever before, staunchly anti-church in terms of going. And they said, don't expect us to ever go to church, really, but they have been listening in every Sunday. And this couple said, if you told me that they were going to be doing this 12 months ago, I would have just laughed, because it was unthinkable that could have happened. Now, that's a very typical story I'm hearing, where people have been invited to connect in, and it's been very unthreatening to do it. They can do it totally and honestly. They can check it out. I talked about the row at the back of the church that people sit in. Yeah, that's what happens live. People come in and they hide. Well, this is a brilliant way of hiding, except they're in the lounge chairs, and they can check it out totally at their own discretion. They can switch off without looking bored if they are bored. They've got total control over it. And so the invitational capacity there has been quite powerful. And I think the novelty factor for everyone who's over the age of 35, Ezzy, is quite significant as well. That is getting online into that sort of space And interestingly, for those who are over 50, being able to invite their friends into that online space is quite a novelty that their friends are quite open to receiving. So there's that sort of online invitational thing is quite significant. We've tried to supplement it in other ways. So I know a number of our churches have actually done letterbox drops to tell people about the online thing they're doing on Sundays. And the thinking behind it is to try and connect people into this community of people that's not actually meeting live right now, so that in due course, when it starts meeting live again, they might join them. So it's the very soft entrance approach with that geography, saturation approach happening. So invitational that way around. Look, I suspect there's also a few people who are Christians who are just channel surfing, and for the first time they can go and check out other churches and no one will know they're doing it and they won't feel guilty about it.
Hey, so
all that
quick
stuff.
follow-up. Do you think you will you have an online presence going forward? Is that something that is a thing that you won't let go of, or will you, as soon as you can get out of it, you won't? And is that evangelistically driven
Yeah. So we feel a bit caught in that we don't want to encourage people to stay in their lounge rooms, chairs forever, which is a risk at this time, especially for those who are thinking they'll never get changed out of their pajamas again. There is a risk with it, I think. Nonetheless, in terms of the way we've connected with a whole stack of people we previously didn't have connections, we are really reluctant to say, we're meeting live again, bad luck, see you again next time we have a coronavirus hit. We don't want to take that step. So we're trying to think through what are the pathways from here moving forward, and they may take a fair while. So we're thinking as a network, we're currently 10 churches. We will try and produce something online regularly that's similar to what we're doing now, but particularly tailored for those who are the guests that we've got right now, with the thought that over time they might triage into evangelistic courses online or live ones, and triage eventually into a local community of believers that we keep introduce them to. So we're planning to do something for all our churches that the churches use, and the churches will be represented in, that are designed to help introduce themselves to those people and invite them along. So that's our plan. We haven't, we're still sketching it out and trying to make it work, but it's very much tailored for those guests we've been connecting with. But also, I know that on any given Sunday, we might have 15% of our people who can't get to church because they're unwell. Now that number is going to grow post-corona, not because people are more sick, but because when they're sick, they'll think, if I've got a cold, I'm not going to church, whereas previously they did. So that factor of non-attendance will grow. And it seems to me that this is a good way of continuing to serve and minister to them when they're in that space. There's a risk with it, a real risk in terms of people getting comfortable to be isolated, and it's dangerous in a whole range of ways for their general well-being as well as their spiritual well-being, I think. But nonetheless, I think it's one we're prepared to engage with and try and, utilise given the space we've come through.
I noticed that in the interview I had with Nicky Gumbel, the Alpha guy, he was saying that he was vehemently opposed to online church, online anything in the lead up to the coronavirus, and he's had a revolution in his thinking just based on how successful their programs have been taken up, and it's an interesting space to negotiate in the days ahead. Anyone can answer this question. You have to, so if you were Rob Elder question. So if you were Rob Elder, who is a university student worker on a campus where it looks like there's another semester of off-campus ahead of them. I'm not sure that that's the case in WA, but it looks like it's the case. I think Rob's in New South Wales. What would you do evangelistically if you were Rob? If you were someone who knew that you were staring down the barrel of another 6 months, so this is not a church, it's a student ministry, another 6 months where you can't physically contact people. So let's all give Rob some ideas.
Ezzy, you should do it.
I had mine on mute though. I was thinking you'd jump in for me, Paul. I think that's an excellent question, Rob. It's something I've been thinking through and something I've been chatting with my AFES friends as well. WA, a couple of the universities are saying, no, we're going to wait a little while. And a couple of them are saying, we're going to do a mixture of coming back and being online. One thing I would say is that most of the students that I speak to, even the ones that were kind of part-time online students watching their lectures at home, they're super keen to go back. And I said to them, I said, you know, you used to watch your lectures online half the time before. What do you reckon? And they're like, no, I'm done. Like, I don't know how long this will last, but I understand they're zoomed out completely. And they really do feel like they'll actually get better education if they're there in 3D. So I think that's a good thing. So Robert, I don't have any fantastic ideas, but my only first idea is thinking, how can I better equip my students who want to go back online? And I even know that even during the Zoom groups, they are doing different online projects. So I know someone was telling me the other day, her big project all for next year has just gone from an individual project to now they've all been put in groups of 4 members. And she doesn't even know half the people that are in her group. So my first thought is, how can we equip our students? Because even though we might not have a big presence as uni church or, you know, on campus ministry, our students are still going to be involved in university circles in some ways or another, whether that's online or in person or even with social groups. So how can I be equipping my uni students to not only know the gospel, but to be prayerfully taking those opportunities to share little bits of their testimony about how they are trusting in Jesus, and also to get them to start, you know, inviting people along to church, whether that's in 3D or online as well. So I think, you know, we might not have that big reach out, but let's dig down deep and equip our people so that they can be the light and salt in the context that they're in. What do you think of that, Paul? What do you want to add?
I think the university students exactly right. I reckon that they are craving relationships and longing to connect again. Therefore, I reckon anything that you do on campus that's either on campus or off campus, but where students generate relational connection with others is going to be a winner, I would have thought, in terms of enabling that to happen and then utilising it to best advantage. But I think that's the opportunity we have across the board right now. So one of the most powerful things that in terms of, you know, if you think about social connection, is the fact that churches, if they're functioning well, are very powerful communities of people. And I think that right now we have the ability to model and communicate what real relationship and real community looks like. And I've got churches that I'm connected with where the members are showing extraordinary love for one another, and others are noticing it. I've got a neighbour who comes to our church who lives around the corner. She's 83 years old, so about 1 kilometre away. So these times I've been getting more walking exercise. So I walk past her house and I'll just send a text to see if she's there. But a couple of times I'll walk past and she's been out the front she's in a retirement sort of village almost. And she's out the front with a few of her friends. And I talk to her and catch up with her and her friends. I can see them watching. And a couple of times I've prayed with her and then I move on, you know. Now, I think that there's this strange connectivity that's happening that Christians can model in a very public way. I ran into our old GP at a coffee shop getting takeaway coffee, and his wife had just gone into a nursing home in COVID lockdown and he couldn't visit her. And he was terribly distressed, you know, and we talked with him and then we prayed with him in the coffee shop. Now, I don't think I normally necessarily would have done that, prayed with him in the coffee shop, but I did then, and people were not surprised I did it. And the same thing happened when I was walking the other day. I ran into someone hadn't seen for a while, whose wife is dying of cancer. And he was there with his father-in-law. We got chatting and just talked, listened, and talked about the promises of God and prayed with him in the middle of the street. And I thought, I don't think I normally do that, but I am now. And I think that sort of community connected public Christianity opportunity seems to be valid right now. And whether it's true for anyone, I think it's just a wonderful opportunity to be God's people in a very open sort of way, I think.
Great. Hey, there might be other people might have what would you do if you were Rob Elder questions, but I want to so chime in. I wanted to direct a couple of questions here to David. So Jeff has mentioned that he goes to quite a large church in Victoria. They've moved to a house church model as an interim measure. Certainly we are doing that to an extent in our church here in Perth, and I know that others are. And then there's a question here about navigating small groups or maintaining them over the coming months. You might want to speak into that, David, but I wonder in particular, thinking about evangelism, what's the missiological thinking on small churches, house churches, missional communities, and so on? Do you think this is that moment? Have you got any sense of how that form is being used in the world evangelistically?
Yeah, I think it's probably too soon to say. In terms of some of those questions around church size, church models, I mean, definitely all of that's coming under the microscope right now. And, you know, as a community, we're going to have to work out answers to that. And the answers might look different even between different states in Australia if lockdown, you know, changes at very different paces in different states. You know, it might not even be a one-size-fits-all answer in Australia. You know, maybe Victoria and New South Wales might be in a different place to other states. But I think one of the things we've got to watch out for, and that I've seen happening a bit around Melbourne at any rate, is that feels to me like house groups have been really significant for people. I'm talking people I talk to, you know, have been even more committed than normal to their small group. And certainly our church has seen a surge in people joining small groups. But then the secular agenda, again, as Paul, I think, was saying, this is a great opportunity to be a consumerist. No one notices if you're not at church on Sunday because it's not easy to log Zoom attendance. And I've noticed, you know, among friends around Melbourne that people have been going back to churches where they kind of feel that they belong, even if it's not the church that they've maybe been attending for the last few years. And so I think there's been quite a lot of consumerism going on. We can try out different things. And I think some people who've been plugging away at church but haven't really felt connected, this has been an opportunity to go back to their old church in wherever they came from before, whether that's a different suburb in the same state or interstate. You know, if we go on providing Zoom after we all come out of lockdown, would we want people to be continuing to go to church interstate? Oh, that sounds like a terrible idea to me. So I think there's a lot of challenge here. You know, if we are allowed to start having gatherings of 100, are we going to split all our larger churches back into congregational models of 100 people? I think you asked, you know, the question missiologically. One of the problems with missiology is that missiology as a discipline tends to be very pragmatic, and that can be a real strength, but it can also be a real weakness. And so making huge major decisions about the structure of our church gatherings based on what lockdown numbers currently are in my view, would be a big mistake. We might need to make some temporary adjustments. And it might be that over the longer term, we consider opportunities that can come out of this. But, there are advantages to big church models. There are advantages to small church models. They've got different strengths and weaknesses, and those aren't going to magically change overnight. They're just going to be complex in different ways.
Thanks, David. Quick one. We're heading towards the end of our time together. It's been really rich. So thank you for your fantastic questions and for your engagement. It's been absolutely fantastic. Quick one from Andrew for Ezzy. Just asking you to drill down a little bit more into what that equipping looks like, the systems and structures and teaching ideas. Can you give us a 2-minute answer to that?
2-minute answer. For people, you can't go where you don't know. So someone asks you a question about suffering or assurance or being anxious. Even for our Christians, you can't go where you don't know. So I think we need to help our people to understand the truth that they've heard and that we know, and have them really sink deep into our hearts so that we can live them out. So what does it really mean that we trust that God's in control? What does it really mean that we know that God will never leave us nor forsake us? How does that actually shape? How does knowing that we have heaven to look forward to and that is secure give us security now to live? So I actually don't think it's any new truths, but I think it's actually helping us all as Christians make sure that we understand something to the ability that we can teach it to others. As a teacher, they say that you don't really learn anything until you have learnt it enough that you can explain it to someone else. And so that's kind of my 2-minute answer on how do we equip people. We want to help them to know the truth so deeply that it pours out of them, so that in whatever situation, they can share those little personal testimonies. Because I do think those are our ins. Those are our ins to chatting about Jesus and the gospel with people. It's sharing your security, and it's sharing the way that you see Jesus and the way that knowing Jesus changed how you live. Those little kind of things that you season in your conversation, people do pick up on.
Paul, great. Ezzy. Paul, quick one for you. Have you prepped your church for people giving up their right if there's an influx of new people? So let's imagine that online catchment. Let's pray God that there's a kind of a revival, and our churches over time, these new people come in. Is there a thing there of asking our existing people to say, listen, there are some rights we might want to give up in the way that we meet, where we meet, can you please make space for this influx? Any thoughts on that, or any preparations for that?
As we've been thinking through the steps back, I think getting into COVID was more straightforward than getting out of it. Because when it hit, suddenly it was snap, everything changed and closed down. Coming back as a stepped process, and every step needs to be negotiated, I think. So for us, coming back, people thinking about their rights, I'm actually saying that we ought to be very slow about getting back to those larger public gatherings when we're talking about 100. So in our network of churches, we've got 16 congregations. I think one of those is less than 100. So if you get everyone back for that 100 meeting, plus, everyone invites a friend along and a third of those people accept, we have a problem because we can't fit them all in. I'd much prefer us not to come back to that 100 size group until we can fit in all the guests. Now we could do that by, having a 70-30 rule where 70 people that we know come and 30 spaces are left for the guests. But it's very clunky and awkward to do it that way. So I came back to that previous conversation. I'm thinking much more about how we multiply the smaller groups in some way, whether it's home churches or, trying to find a stack of facilities that can take 30 or 50 and getting multiple, training up leaders to host and develop those groups until the point where we can meet back together again. And hopefully the capacity will have developed and grown and multiplied over that time, so that when we get together in the big groups when we're allowed to, there's a lot more people there. So I think rather than the giving up of rights, I'm talking much more about the compulsion of the gospel. That means we'll make sure that we take the outsider with us to investigate the gospel with us, and therefore we'll make decisions that necessitate us creating space so that that can happen, and that being the driver for how we think about that evangelistic side. It's not the only question to ask, but I think when we're thinking about the guests, we can't make decisions that leave them behind, or where, you know, it becomes quite selfish. Our quest to meet with God's people, which is a natural desire, that can't override the mission to take the gospel to others. So that's the way we're trying to think it through anyway.
That's great. That's great. Guys, our time's done. And over on the East Coast, it's nearly time to go to bed. Over here, the night's young. We can party on to the wee small hours, as we do every night.
Because we're allowed outside in Perth, Ross.
We are. Anthony, I'm so sorry we didn't get to your question, but I'm going to take it as a comment, really. Anthony's pointed out that change is such a constant in this moment, and almost the source of so much of our anxiety. And he's pointed out that we have an opportunity to speak of God's unchanging love into that place. And maybe that's a point at which to end through all these changes, that we have an unchanging God who's fast in his love, fast in his hand held out to the lost. So as we navigate the uncertainty, I think Paul's right that it's harder leaving, harder getting out than it is coming in, more challenging, and we can hold on to an unchanging God. Thank you so much, David. Thank you so much, Paul. Thank you so much, Eryn-May. And thank you to TGC and the team there for making tonight possible. Thank you, everyone, for your fantastic questions and engagement. So grace and peace to you all, and good night.